maybe we were laggards with the internet, maybe we were laggards with the cloud, maybe we were laggards with mobile. With AI, there's almost not going to be an option to be a laggard because you will just get leapfrogged, and companies that you don't even see as competitors will be able to do what you do and probably 100 times more efficient if they take an AI first approach to their. MIT came out with a research report that said essentially 95% of company AI implementations are failing, thereby only 5% are succeeding. Companies with their first AI implementation are trying to hit home runs. They're trying to boil the ocean, trying to go too big too soon.
Well, welcome to Source Code's first podcast. Hopefully the first of many, and we're really excited here to really try and cover topics that both affect, empower, and provide value to both investors and operators, sponsors, all working with middle market companies. And I think the topic for today, which is really how technology and AI affects and can be used effectively to instigate benefits to middle market kind of companies. And as a guest today, I've got Ryan Frederick, the principal at AWH. And I'll let him do a quick intro before we start to dive into the good stuff.
Tom, thanks for having me. Good to see you. We rebranded it to Transform Labs too.
Oh, yep.
So about 2 years ago we did that. But we've known each other a long time, and for most of the time that we've known each other, we were AWH. And I'm a principal there, as Tom said, and we're a technology advisory firm. We help companies, mostly mid-market companies, to leverage technology better. Sometimes that means data, sometimes that means integrations, sometimes that means building something custom. Sometimes it just means helping them go in a direction, and for us to be truly a guide and give them a compass heading and say, hey, you might consider this. And sometimes that just means off-the-shelf software to solve the problem that they have and friction in the business. And of course, now everybody's involved in AI to some degree, or at least they should be. Even for those that are not sure what to do and they're figuring it out, there is at least enough interest and experimentation going on that I would say that most people are digging around the edges of AI if they haven't dug a hole and jumped fully in and are chest deep at this point.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So maybe you could just quickly touch on kind of your background, how you ended up, in that role, and how you got there.
Yeah, I sold a company 17 years ago, so I've been now with Transform Labs for 15 years, which seems amazing because it seems like in some ways it was just yesterday. And I took a year off. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I didn't think I had it in me to start another company. So I started asking around. My now partner, Chris, said, why don't you come here? We worked that out. So 15 years later, here we are. And it really gives me the ability. And I do a lot of speaking now about AI. I just started and announced yesterday that I'm launching a fund to invest in AI companies. And so our work at Transform Labs gives me both a front row seat from speaking to business owners and operators about technology and AI, but also gives me access to deal flow in some companies who are trying to build new products and create new categories and new ways of working in business through AI. So it's a really fun sort of intersection position to be in. And man, I'm just having fun every day.
That's awesome. And I think what's really interesting to me is just the learning that you have going from building your own software company to trying to help other companies by implementing software, because they're two very different, things. Even for us, when we look at the microcosm of deal sourcing, when we were doing that internally to deploy our own capital and then spun it out as a service, it's a completely different kind of endeavor, right? Because you have control over less. And I think what's really interesting to me is you've been through 15 years of implementing technology at companies. So I'd really love to understand you know, what in that time, what makes a company that's operating ready for kind of that focus on technology, and what makes them, good or bad at actually being able to implement that in a meaningful way?
I'm going to start with the bad first, mostly because of my pessimistic nature, I guess. Most companies in the mid market don't value technology as a strategic asset. They view it as a cost center, they view it as tactical. And if you look at the enterprise level, whether you're talking about a big bank like Chase, or you're talking about a big restaurant company like Wendy's, if you're talking about a company that manufactures equipment, or that's the legacy business, John Deere, these companies are as much technology companies as they are banking, restaurant, and agricultural equipment companies. Because you can't do what they do at scale. Technology still isn't viewed that way by and large. It's still viewed very tactically, and often it's left to IT, if the company has an IT department, for IT to drive the technology implementations. And you get very then technically and tactically oriented technology implementations and projects, because IT will look at it and say, well, it technically works, so that means it's a successful project, even if it doesn't drive the business outcomes that the company ultimately wants from the technology. So I think most companies are getting it wrong when they treat technology too tactically and not as an asset and not strategically enough. AI is going to now challenge a lot of those premise as well, because you've got companies who are now saying, with reason, well, maybe we were laggards with the internet, maybe we were laggards with the cloud, maybe we were laggards with mobile. With AI, there's almost not going to be an option to be a laggard, because you will just get leapfrogged, and companies that you don't even see as competitors will be able to do what you do, and probably 100 times more efficient if they take an AI first approach to their operating model and how they operate the business. So AI may be the thing that gets some laggards and some mid-market companies that are behind on technology to actually be current. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer, but I could go on forever on some of the stuff.
No, I think that makes sense, and I think to your point, right, the mid market, I think, is a huge range, right? Whether it's a $5 or $10 million revenue company or 250 million, but within that spectrum, there's oftentimes not that much dissimilar. They're not too dissimilar at the small scale and the larger scale, in terms of they tend to be very good at what they do.
Yes.
And oftentimes, what I see is what allows a company to kind of achieve that next level of growth is becoming experts at the things that aren't core to your business, whether it's sales and marketing, training and recruiting. But technology is certainly, a part of that. And, the cost and time to value used to be so high. So I'd imagine that kind of made it a more difficult implementation process compared to, how quickly you could produce value in some scenarios now.
For sure. Legacy software was slower. It was more methodical, more expensive than it is now, from every perspective, whether you were talking about buying something and implementing it, customizing it, configuring it, or building something custom for your company's operation and processes, so that the software and the processes align very closely. And that's changed pretty significantly now. And we've migrated even through software, and AI is going to affect this too, where it used to be where development led the day. Because if it technically worked and it was functional, then it was considered good software. And then design took over for a decade or more, because then we figured out, well, just because we wrote good code and it works doesn't mean that the user is going to value it and the user is going to enjoy using it and the user is going to keep using it. So then design, user experience, user interface, that sort of had its run. Now with AI is writing code. AI is also helping design products. It's also helping with product management around what should be in the product, what should it do, what should it not do, et cetera. And AI is reducing the cost of software pretty dramatically, and that's just going to continue. In fact, Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft earlier this year, said that AI was going to eat software. And I think that's probably true. And he doesn't really want to admit that. He runs one of the largest software companies in the world. So he doesn't want to admit AI is going to cannibalize his business. But he's being intellectually honest with the fact that it is going to cannibalize his business. And so software is getting faster, easier to do for lots of reasons. That also can be a problem because just because you can do it faster and easier doesn't mean that you're going to implement it in a way and leverage it in a way that's actually going to drive real value for the business. It's never been easier to start a company. That doesn't mean you should just go out and start a company because it's easier or build a product because it's easier. Easier doesn't necessarily, easier to get initiated doesn't mean easier to success, because I think the gap between it's easy to start and success, I think that gap is as wide as it's ever been.
Yep. And so when you think about the things that made you successful in implementing software historically or modernizing your tech stack historically, do you think those same things make you successful today and it's just the vehicle for producing that is different?
I do think that most of the principles hold up. MIT came out with a research report, I want to say a month ago now, that said essentially 95% of company AI implementations are failing, thereby only 5% are succeeding. And in the research report, and I fundamentally agree with it, it outlines why the 5 are the 5 and why the 95 are the 95. And it calls out things like companies with their first AI implementation are trying to hit home runs. They're trying to boil the ocean and other cliches of they're trying to go too big too soon. So an analogy that I now use is a company says, well, let's use AI to automate our finance operation. Well, inside of any company's finance operation, there are a myriad of transactions, processes happening. And so doing that out of the gate, it's almost sort of guaranteed to fail because you're using new tools, a new technology, new systems, et cetera. So the chances of that succeeding are very low. And so it really goes back to being iterative, starting out and hitting some singles and then stacking some singles on top of each other and then hitting some doubles. So companies need to be more realistic about the fact they're learning a new technology, ecosystem, and infrastructure, and they can't just come out of the gate and think, oh, we're going to be good at AI on our first at bat, because that's highly unlikely to happen. Good software, good technology projects have always been about, let's get through this phase and then let's get to another phase and take it in chunks that are manageable and that you can have some control over success. Same thing is true with AI.
Yeah, I think when we look at how we implement it here, it's often on the micro level, right? We have this specific workflow or process that has this specific bottleneck. How can we solve that? And all of a sudden, as you solve more of those bottlenecks, you now have a process that gets more and more automated, right? But to me, what a lot of this kind of underpins, right, is that you need this kind of mindset that we're going to try, we're not going to commit to it, and if it doesn't move mountains right away, we're not going to abandon it. So when you're selling that as a service to companies, like how do you manage that expectation?
Yeah, we talk about courage a lot, that it takes some level of leadership courage to say, we are going to start acting upon this, even if we fail our first couple of times, because if we don't start and we don't start learning and we don't start experimenting, then when are we going to start? And so it does take some courage to say, we're going to invest, we're going to put some time, effort, and energy into this, because we know that AI ultimately isn't optional for us to participate in as a company. And so it takes some leadership courage. So we actually talked to, and I've had the privilege this year of speaking across the country at different conferences and events. And one of the things that I talk about is this takes leadership courage, because you've got to be able to say, we don't exactly know how long this is going to take. We don't exactly know how much it's going to cost. But what we do know is if we don't find a way to leverage AI, we're probably going to be at a competitive disadvantage. But it does take some leadership courage when you don't exactly know what the path looks like and even what the destination is, other than you're going to start knocking out some micro pieces of friction in some of your processes and workflows, and then stacking those on top of each other and going, oh, man, well now over the last 24 months, we have automated most of our finance department just one step at a time.
Yep. And so when you think about that, how does this translate for company owners? If I'm running a $20 million, services company, how should I be thinking about implementing AI in the most practical sense? Because I think, oftentimes you hear conversations like this and they're very high level, they're very abstract. Leadership courage is, it's true, but it also sounds great as a soundbite.
Yeah, and it also, and people are going to be like, well, what does that mean?
Yes.
Right, yeah.
So if I'm let's use an example, a $25 million professional services company, what do I need to do when it comes to thinking about budget, thinking about timelines, thinking about in a tangible way? How should I identify what firm to work with? Like, how would you, if you were in that seat, really go about executing on this process?
Yeah, I think that ultimately I talk about this as I'm traveling the country talking about AI as well. There's a lot of AI snake oil out there now. So there are a lot of firms or a lot of people who are now suddenly AI experts, gurus, consultants, etc. Most of them don't know any more than anyone else. They just happen to maybe use ChatGPT one day before you started using it. So there is a lot of buyer beware right now. I think you also have to watch out for getting on a tool carousel and saying, okay, we're going to use this, and then you hear, oh, well, this model benchmarked better, or this tool did this update. Oh, so now we're going to switch from this tool to this tool. That you'll end up chasing your tail, trying to chase AI tools. And so I see a lot of companies doing that too, because it's easy just to go, oh, I'm going to unsubscribe from this one, I'm going to subscribe to this one. It might be better for a day or two, or maybe even 2 weeks, but in the long run, they all sort of level out, and they wouldn't be where they are if they weren't competitive. So that's something to watch out for. And then you can, if you're approaching it in an iterative, experimental way, you can do AI projects pretty quickly. We've seen some with our clients where we've had something stood up in 6 weeks, because it depends on what that is, of course. But if you are definitive enough around saying this is an area of friction for us in the business, is it a candidate for AI? If it is a candidate for AI, then if it's micro and it's that small of a piece of a process, or that small of a process in its entirety, it doesn't have to take a long time to then get some wins and say, all right, we're starting to get our AI legs under us, and now we can begin taking on bigger efforts. And from a financial perspective, those initial ones, can be anywhere from 10 to 30 grand.
Yep.
to tackle. And again, that's probably not going to break any company's budget at the end of the day. But they also have to understand doing one of those is also not going to make them an AI company. And they've got to do maybe 10, 12, 20 of those ultimately.
Yeah.
So then you start stacking them on top of each other, the price tag, begins to creep up. But I was talking with a client the other day, and ultimately we've got, I think, a 4-phased approach with them, and each phase is about 20 grand. But they could pause at each of the phases and say, you know what, we're not up for the next phase yet. We want to wait a quarter or 2 quarters or whatever. So then you can cash flow it appropriately. And so, like, if you were moving to the cloud from on-premise, was kind of all or nothing, right? You wouldn't do some things in the cloud and then have some things on premise, because that would be like standing in the middle of the road with one foot in one lane and the other in the other lane. But AI does allow you to progress into it at a pace that makes sense for your company, whether it's operationally, culturally, financially, or whatever other metric or sort of lens we want to look at it through.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, I think, because you brought up something in there that I think is really interesting as well, which is, when you decide, who to hire, there are these, AI experts, AI gurus, which are oftentimes just connecting third-party tools through, N8N or something like that. And then you have firms where, I think one of the things that I've learned, hiring a fair amount of outsourced software development firms in my time, is the best ones understand your business. And they have this really fine line of yes, we're good at building technology, but we're also really good at understanding your business. So when you're looking at evaluating or hiring, how do you decide if you should be hiring kind of maybe a more legacy software development firm, or if you should be hiring somebody that looks more nimble and more new and maybe has some of this expertise in AI? Especially when you don't have maybe somebody on your team that is an expert or has hired software development firms before. So how would you go about that if you were kind of in that situation?
Yeah, it is difficult, because oftentimes the people, the firms that look the shiniest and the newest aren't going to have as much experience for you to judge do they do quality work? Are they going to be around, et cetera? In some ways, that's risky. The legacy firms often haven't kept up and don't keep up with the modern stuff, and so that brings its share of risk. So ultimately, if you can find a combination of the two, that's probably ideal. And we were talking earlier before we started recording that there's a balance between looking at technology tactically and looking at it as a strategic asset. And the only way to look at technology as a strategic asset is through the business lens first, not the technology lens. And we don't go to and we don't sponsor a lot of technology conferences and events. We mostly go to, and I speak at, business operator, owner, finance kind of conferences and events, because our best value as a partner to these companies is to be going from the business perspective to technology, not technology to business. Because if you come from the technology side first, everything looks, if we use the analogy of technology, then let's just call it a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yep.
And if you come from the business side, it's, well, how do we apply this technology? How do we apply data to this area of the operation? How do we apply AI now? So it forces you into different conversations and different evaluations versus, I've got technology, I know technology stuff. Let me just start whacking at nails that are popping up.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting to me is we have a mix, right? We have engineers on staff, and then we also have some outsourced resources that we've used, and then we have contracts resources in some scenarios because you need something highly specialized. But the team members that we have on staff that really understand our business on a granular level, the amount of kind of friction that they're able to reduce, because there's often times when you look at any situation from the outside looking in, you don't understand why it's done that way.
Right.
But then there's this internal inertia, which makes it sometimes hard to change those legacy things. Even though you might know it's slightly inefficient, there's reasons why it has to be like that. And so that bridge is always kind of a tough one to cross.
Context and collaboration.
Yeah.
Yep. Every great technology product, every great software project, the success ultimately comes down to context and collaboration. How well do the people working on the project understand the context of the business, and how well do they collaborate with the business subject matter expert? And that's true whether it's outsourced and in, or if it's internal people, because we've all also seen internal projects that go sideways and fail because the business owner, if we call it that for the project, either didn't share context well enough, didn't collaborate effectively enough, or the technology team didn't. But context and collaboration are the two C's that I always fall back on. If you don't have those things inside of a technology project, the likelihood that that technology project is going to fail go up pretty exponentially.
Yep, that makes sense. And so when I think, a lot of our audience here are either investors in middle market companies or operators, and from the investor side, your technical diligence during the kind of getting to know you and diligence stage of a company is incredibly important now. Because oftentimes part of your thesis is this idea of modernization and implementing technology. So when you think about going from, almost no idea to quickly trying to understand, where their strengths, where their weaknesses are, what's possible on technology, how do you think you can do that efficiently? What are the things you should be looking for, and what are kind of red flags?
Yeah, you ultimately want to understand, I think, three things fundamentally. How good of a data company are they? And when you ask for data, how difficult is it for the company to produce the data? And it could be financial data, it could be operational data, et cetera. Most companies in the mid-market think they're good data companies, and then when challenged to act as a good data company, they realize that they fall short. Part and parcel with that, I would say, is how integrated is the company, even the way that it operates today, not considering outside integrations. And this is a little bit piggybacking on the data piece. Do they have data silos? Do they have people or processes that are taking data from one system to another system that could easily have been integrated together and talking together, right? So, because if they've got that kind of process inefficiency now, their ability to then get rolled up and integrated with others is going to be challenging.
Yep.
And then you've got the people part of it. If they have technology team members inside of the company, maybe it's a director of IT, maybe they've got a developer or two, maybe they've got a designer, maybe they've got a product owner, a product management person, depending on the size of the company. Are those people in the right seats on the bus? And oftentimes what you'll see is, well, this developer's been here for 20 years, so we just sort of let him do whatever he wants. And then when you start peeling back the layers, part of the reason that all of their systems and all of their software is legacy is because the person who's in charge of that has not modernized their skills and doesn't understand like what modern software looks like.
Yep.
So the data integration people piece to me is the primary triumvirate there that you're trying to do due diligence on. If they're using software inappropriately, which, we often still see as well, which is they've got an ERP and they've got a CRM, and then somehow there's still this Excel train that exists that really runs the company. Mm-hmm. And it's like, so those are the things you want to ferret out too, because then you've got to get that, you've got to extricate that, get it into systems so that you're not reinforcing bad behavior and bad process as you're now looking to acquire the company and either operate it or make an investment because you're trying to get the company to scale. Those kinds of legacy workarounds are things that are often behind the curtain that aren't obvious, but they can really prevent a company from scaling and reaching their potential because they've got these anchors that are happening on the business.
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things for any company is to get off the Excel train.
It is. It's very hard.
Yeah.
It may be the software product in the history of the universe that has been bastardized the most to do things that it's not really intended to do, but is good enough to do them that we continue to use it to do it. And so, yeah, Excel is probably the most versatile software product that's ever been built, frankly.
And then, you've got macros built on top of it that, 4 hires before built, and nobody knows how they really work anymore. They just know that if you do it this way, it kind of works.
Yes, if you do this, and then, oh my God, don't touch the formula and don't touch the
Yeah.
pivot table, right? It's just like you put data in on this
Yeah.
tab and you're good. Yeah, a lot of that in the world.
You tap your head 2 times, click the mouse twice, and then it all just works.
Yes, and then somehow you get the report and the output that you wanted.
Yeah. And I think during our journey of software development and kind of starting to implement and, implementing AI in our workflows, one of the most difficult parts is it immediately becomes true that you need this kind of central source of data, this one true source, because it's so easy to start when you have different data storage vehicles, be it, cloud, no-code databases, CRMs, third-party software where you have your operational data. You need this one true source because you now have all of these agents acting independently of humans, and they can often run into each other. They can create inefficiencies and problems that you didn't know existed. So when you think about, being a data company, being good at data, how do you start that? And how do you evaluate where you are as a data company?
Yeah, it's not easy because I think most companies think they are a good data company. And so there's a little bit of education that has to go on to drive the awareness of, okay, you're not really a good data company because you have all this disparate data that ultimately doesn't come together in one true source and in one place of truth. So sometimes it becomes getting them up on a data warehouse and having all these disparate data sources feeding into the central repository. Sometimes companies also need to look at some synthetic data because sometimes they may not have enough data to support training a model, leveraging agents, because they don't have enough data in some piece of that process chain where it gets weak, and then the model and/or the agents begin to fall down because they just don't have enough data to act on. So sometimes there are strategies now to be able to bolster your data and at least the volume of it. You can take your data sets and then you can create some synthetic data off of some of the existing data that you have to make your data footprint bigger to leverage models and AI better. There also, I think, is a gap between we're all going to now have these agents running, and you spoke to sometimes there are these collisions and agent dependencies. One of the pieces that we don't really have yet and this is where we do a lot of work with clients, is on this agent orchestration layer. Like figuring out, okay, is this agent always waiting on these other two agents? Is this agent conflicting with this agent and causing this agent to spiral in a way that wasn't predicted, et cetera? We also now know, and credit to the team at Thinking Machines, one of the things that the whole AI machine learning world was trying to figure out was, if you keep putting in consistent data into a model, why would you get inconsistent output? And what they found out was the models behave differently under load, which commonsensically makes sense because our computers don't operate the same under heavy load. Nothing does. No machine does. No person does. So no machine learning model is going to operate at the same level under heavy load. So your ability to manage your load as well matters in the accuracy and performance of your models and your agents. So sometimes you actually need to throttle back model load and/or how much data you're feeding in, because the models will behave differently when they're under heavier load and heavier use.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that we're kind of still tying this down to real world examples. So when we talk about being a good data company, you talk about operational or sales data or CRM data. Can you just talk maybe about the different phases that a company might go through from, starting out as a almost no data company to being a good data company?
Yeah, it really does. And typically, companies are going to be better data companies in some areas than others. And I would say it goes back to what is their DNA? So if they're a sales-driven organization and sales sort of steers the ship, they're probably going to be a better sales data company. Their CRM is probably going to have better data in it than their operational systems or their finance systems or what have you. If they're an operationally focused company and they really pride themselves on the fact that they're highly efficient, highly performative, highly productive, they're probably going to have better operational data than sales and marketing data, for example. So it is, what is the company value that probably is going to equate to where they're a good data company, and what they don't value as much is probably where they're going to be weaker as a data company. And then it becomes acknowledging that and saying, okay, you value being a high-performing operating company, and that's why the sales team barely uses the CRM and why you don't have a lot of sales data per se. So then there's got to be some level of awareness and then training and process change for sales to get better at data and better use of the CRM to then counteract the good operating data that they have. And so, and some of that then becomes, and some of this becomes non-technical. Some of this is managerial and leadership and accountability, et cetera. Because if you've got great operating data and you don't have great sales data, then it's something that you have to then hold people accountable to have good sales data. But there's process, culture, people change involved in some of this stuff. Data just doesn't get created out of thin air. So there are a lot of human components to that are, on the surface, it sounds easy. Just become a better sales data company. In practice, that's harder because you've already allowed the sales team not to be a good to not be a good data team. Getting them to become a good data team is not going to happen overnight.
Yeah. And when you're thinking about when you're a company potentially implementing technology or AI or software, do you think it's best to start in the areas where you're strongest? And, if you are great at sales data, is that where we should look at, trying to leverage technology to even improve that? Or do you think it makes more sense to look at where you're weakest, or is there just no rule here?
I don't think there's a rule necessarily. I do think that you have to take all those factors into consideration. I think you also have to look at where's the friction in the business. And if the friction in the business, even though you don't have a lot of sales data, if the friction in the business is customers say it's too hard to place an order with you, then I would look at how do you make that process easier and more understandable for customers, and don't worry about necessarily becoming a good sales data company yet. So, but all of these things, that's why you have to start from the business side and not the technology side, because you have to start with what are you good at, where are you not good, where's the friction in the business. And I would also say this, and I believe this strongly, whether it's AI or any other technology software initiative, if the customer doesn't feel it and experience it, and if your value proposition with that customer doesn't go up, you're gonna get a short-term shot of adrenaline from doing whatever that project is, but it's not going to really move the needle that much for the company overall. So if you automate your internal expense process using AI, you're marginally more efficient, you're marginally more productive. But in the end, if the customer doesn't feel it and doesn't experience it, I would argue that it sort of doesn't matter. So I think about, again, back to technology as an asset, even when you're using AI to automate processes, workflows, and systems, you've got to find a way to connect that to the customer so that you're actually getting a real return on the investment of time, money, and energy into that automation. And that still doesn't happen enough. It doesn't get extended out to how does this actually going to impact our relationship and our value proposition with our customers.
Yeah, I think that's one where, even for when I look internally, right, we often look at technology and AI as we have a very human-driven business, right, connecting with company owners, understanding what they want, connecting with potential investors. And we look at it as how can we increase the throughput of our team? How can our team spend more time doing what really moves the needle for our clients and the company owners that we work with, and less time doing things like updating the CRM with notes, and less time doing the things which, while they're value added, they're not the value that we want our human team to add, right? We think that's where we can really leverage and rely on software.
But as long as you're keeping that top of mind of
Yeah.
let's make these internal processes more efficient so that we can have better, more valuable conversations
Yep.
with owners and investors, then the customers are feeling it, even though they don't really know, right?
Yep.
That you're driving internal efficiency. But there's just too many times where a company, and this is an easy statement to make, and it's not an epiphany. No company has ever cost saved its way to success in the history of companies.
Yeah, especially at this scale, right? Like,
Right.
you know, if you're doing 10 million a year to get to 100 million a year, there's no amount of cost savings that will just produce 90 millions of our revenue, right? It's not how it works.
No, so it's got to correlate to customer increased value, increased customer experience, and it's great to be efficient and productive, and every company should strive to be that. But like you were saying, it's got to correlate to now we have this extra time that we can spend with customers. We can now add more value because this is taken care of and we don't have to worry about it. We don't have to work on it. We don't have to spend time on it. But that's got to be top of mind because often it isn't.
Yeah. And so I think this is a great segue into, you know, oftentimes you're building either products for internal use or you're building things for external use. Is there a different approach that you need for those two different scenarios, or how do you think about just that?
There shouldn't be, but there are nuances that are different. And probably the primary one is you have a little bit of control and command over internal users. You can say to your customer success team, your sales team, you are going to use this product. It's part of your job. It's part of working here.
Yeah.
And so there's not an option for them to opt out of using it. So your customer discovery, your validation around what should it do, how should it work, gets shrunk way down because you have the ability to control their use and their lack of optionality around it. With external users, they don't have to use anything you put out. So the time that you spend with external users validating, does this meet the need? Would you use this? Does this add value for you? Tell me what you don't like about it. Tell me why it isn't going to increase our relationship, et cetera. There's a much longer customer discovery validation period with external users than internal users.
Yeah, I think one of the great parts about building software for internal uses is how short the feedback loop is, right? And if it's not short, then that's a huge issue.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would caveat that if you've got a culture where people are not providing feedback about, oh, this thing sucks,
Yeah.
and this actually is making my job harder, not easier, then you've got a management leadership cultural problem. Because in the end, every team member should feel very empowered to come back to whoever they need to come back to, whoever they report to, and say, yeah, I know we said that it was going to work this way, and I thought that was going to be okay, but it turns out, no, this is actually taking me more time to do my work than it was before. And then you should course correct immediately. And you should have that kind of relationship and dynamic inside the company with internal users, but that doesn't always happen either, depending on the culture of the company.
Yeah, I think that you want that the ideal scenario, right, is where your team has experienced so much value that they're getting excited about when new releases are pushed into production because they want to test it, right? This can make my day better. I want to give that feedback that makes the next iteration of this even better because it helps me.
Absolutely, yeah. I fundamentally believe everyone wants to do a good job. Yeah. And if you come from that premise, then they want tools that are going to help them do a good job. They're not, and back to the Excel thing, if they're continuing to use Excel, it's because they perceive that helps them do their job better than whatever else they have access to. And they just haven't been listened to around those other products and around those other systems. And so they default back to what they perceive helps them do their job better, which is the Excel train.
Yeah, and I think change management is always like a cultural issue that's difficult with anything in a company, whether it's software or whatever it is, org chart or whatever. And I think getting good at change management and getting people excited and feeling heard is always a key part of the process.
It is, and change management is one of these things that you don't really, you don't, it's hard to do. You don't really know what it is, right? When someone says change management, well, is that we write up a lot of documentation? Is that we do a lot of training? Is it a cultural thing? Is it bad management and bad leadership, and we just need to fire the person who leads that department because people in their department don't get on the bus and don't cooperate with things? So change management is this nebulous area because it's an all-encompassing bucket that we throw all this stuff into. I think change management can get simplified to ask users, if you're going to do something that changes a process, a workflow, or a system in your company, the people who are affected by that change, if you don't get their feedback on what the new solution is going to be and the new approach is going to be, shame on you. I mean, that's just sort of bad management and bad leadership. And then back to context and collaboration. They need context about why you're doing it. What do you expect to get out of it?
Yep.
And then they need to be collaborating at the table with the people who are actually implementing the thing, building the thing, et cetera. And so I'm a big believer in, for external products, I'm a big believer in customer advisory boards and teams where you get 6 or 7 key customers together to help guide the design and building of the product so it aligns with their needs. You should do the same thing internally. You should have a user advisory board internally to say, hey, are we headed down the right, like, does this make sense? Are we headed in the right direction? Because before you make a misstep and head in the wrong direction or fall off the cliff, they can save you from it and go, no, that's like the dumbest thing ever. Why would we do it that way?
Yeah, and I think that's both, oftentimes it's the time and the capacity for change, right? If you keep having these false starts, hey, we're trying to implement this and it didn't quite work out, and now we're doing this and it didn't quite work out, you basically kind of lose your capital with those people to push change.
You do, and you have to be careful internally and externally with this customer or user advisory board.
Yep.
Because you can't lose your credibility with them, and ultimately, and you shouldn't, because if they're directing you and they're saying this is what we would value, this is what we would use, this is how we would want it to work, and before you actually build it, you then come back to them in different ways and mechanisms through different channels to validate that that's true. We had a client probably 10 years ago, maybe even longer than that we were building out a new system with them, and we went to a subset of their customers, and we formed this customer advisory board, and we asked them through different contexts, how would they rank these features and the functionality and the value and all these things. And what they said digitally in writing was different than what we then went back to them and asked them in person 48 hours later and said, hey, how would you rank these things? And we did it that way on purpose, because when people have a chance to, and it's going to be recorded by somebody like actually filling out a survey and putting in a response, they will respond differently than they're just responding to you conversationally, and they don't think it's being recorded, like documented.
I can see that. It's funny because like that whole consumer research is always like a something that's really easy to like point and laugh at, in focus groups, but actually executing it well is really difficult.
It is, because people will say what they think you want to hear,
Yep.
and then they will act incongruently with what they said. And you
Yes.
have to watch out for that from users internally or externally. So you have to validate what they say from what they do in different channels and different mechanisms and through different dynamics. And so hopefully you're not falling off that many cliffs. You're redirecting on the trail before you ever get to a cliff because you're validating in very dynamic, sort of nuanced ways.
So, if you were the operator of a $20 million company and you wanted to start hiring and, figuring out what the next step is, you don't know, you've never used a service provider before. This is just not something you've ever tackled. You may have you probably have some IT function, but they're not really a modernization or development function. What are the exact steps that you would go by in order to go from, okay, we want to start exploring implementing technology and AI to doing it?
Yeah, I would say talk to a lot of firms because you want to see, you want to be able to vet, yes, technical chops. You want to vet, how long have they been doing it? Are they credible? Do their clients have good experiences with them, et cetera? But back to the context and collaboration piece, you also want to spend some time with the ones that you are leaning towards and you like the best, because you ultimately need to determine, just as they should be determining of you, can you work together?
Yep.
Because there are going to be points in the road where there's going to be some speed bumps and some potholes where you think something's taking too long, you think something's too expensive, you don't understand this part of it, and they've got to explain it to you. And there's going to be some parts where they're asking you and putting pressure on you for access to systems that the person that on your team who has access to those systems is, at a wedding in France for 3 weeks.
Yep.
So there's still going to be consternation even when you like each other. And so you've got to really make sure you pick a partner that you can get along with and that there's mutual respect. Because without that, it's going to be very hard to get anything across the finish line, because eventually the friction inside of the communication, collaboration, relationship dynamic will eat away to where it's then like, okay, we don't really enjoy working with you guys anymore. Well, we don't really enjoy working with you anymore. And then it sort of, there's a separation. And that's depending on the size and scope of the project, right? It might be bookended anyway, where it's like, hey, when we get to this point, we're going to be done. But too many things end prematurely because there wasn't enough time up front about, can we actually work together?
Yeah. And so if you are non-technical and you're trying to evaluate the technical capabilities of a firm, how do you go about that?
Talk to clients, talk to their current clients, previous clients around, did they know what they were doing? Did they make good recommendations? Did they take you in a direction that was positive? Yeah. Did they make you a technically better company, right, as part of it? Because ultimately, too much of this goes on too, where a technology firm will look at a client as a evergreen client, and they create a dynamic where that client is now dependent upon them to make updates, upgrade things, evolve things, et cetera, et cetera. We don't operate that way because we want clients ultimately to be independent of us, because we don't want to operate like most of the other technology consulting firms, which is once they're in, they don't want to ever be out. Mm-hmm. And so I think also talking to previous clients about, was this a relationship where you felt like you couldn't get rid of them? Or was this a relationship where they were like, you're good, right? Are you okay? If you're good, then we're going to move on, or we're going to go help somebody else, right? Yep. Which is really, now if you need the ongoing support, cool, talk about that, set that up, et cetera. But if don't get yourself in a situation where you're now almost being held captive by the technology consulting firm just because they know more about technology than you do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And when you think about outlining that initial scope initially, can you just talk about how you think about project-based versus hourly billing and how you see like, maybe situations set up to succeed based on how that's negotiated versus situations where it's set up to fail based on how that's negotiated?
Yeah, it is. I like the fact that you use the word situation because it is situational. And back to that context piece, you can do fixed price sort of closed loop projects that are fixed fee if there's great context. If there isn't great context, then it probably needs to be more hourly time and material based, because without the context, the technology service firm is going to be saying, okay, well, we don't know, this is somewhere between 20 grand and 120 grand. And they're going to give you a really big range because they're trying to protect their downside. They're also trying to do a reasonably good job of saying, you know what, we think it's probably going to be somewhere in the middle is what they're really saying inside of the range, right? But that almost always never holds water because without the context, you get into it and 4 weeks into a 15-week project, let's say, let's go with 16 weeks just to keep it, more even. 4 weeks into a 16-week project, they're now going, oh my God, like we had no idea this needed to be part of it, this needed to be part of it, this needed to be part of it. So our 20 to 120 range is now 220 to 250. And so context matters, and it's situational between if there's a lot of context, yes, fixed fee can work. If there's not a lot of context, it probably needs to be time and material. The other thing that you can do is do an initial design, discovery, they have different names, engagement, to say, let's spend some time over the next 6 to 8 weeks establishing the context.
Yeah. And I think what I'd also like to understand is,
I mean, does that jive with what you've experienced and seen?
yeah, because I've been a part of all of it, right? I've
Yeah.
been a part of fixed projects that go bad because of a lot of reasons. I've been, hourly relationships that work fantastically. I think where I've always found a lot of value is trying to really spend time defining the scope, because scope creep is really hard to avoid.
It is. Well, it's impossible.
Yeah.
Right? Because there are known unknowns. You don't know what, especially when you start talking to users, and the user says, well, you know what? If it worked that way, that would be okay.
Yeah.
But it would be really good if it worked this way. And it's like, okay, well, that's going to add another 2 weeks of design and development, et cetera.
Yeah.
But then you have an obligation to do it because a user said this would be better.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that I feel I'm much better at now is managing the relationship, the scope, and the process. I mean, it's very easy for a project to get away very quickly, both from a time kind of time frame, amount of time, but also the time your team spends on it, and then also the spend, right? So when you look at some of the things that you think can help avoid that scope just massively growing, what have you seen be successful?
Yeah, make some hard choices and put some guardrails in place that are non-negotiables. I.e., you can even say in a situation where it's like, okay, we've gotten enough user validation and feedback, even though we're going to keep getting more user validation and feedback, this is the point that we're cutting off this version, this phase, or what have you, and we're not going to keep iterating. All right. And anything that we now hear from users is going to go in a backlog, right, for a future version, future phase. The same is true around every aspect of a technology project. At some point, you have to say, like, we don't need anything else to inform how we're going to do this. And so we're now going to move forward based upon what we now mutually agree is the footprint of the project. And then you have context from both sides going, okay, this is the thing.
Yeah. And when things aren't going well, like let's say that, you're at that point where neither side is happy because I'm sure you get feelings where the client is changing, they're not consistent, their goals, their wants, the scope has changed. The client at that same time feels like, hey, we're not making the progress we want on the stuff that we want. They don't necessarily always understand how their behavior affects what's happening. How do you reconcile that if you're, from the company owner perspective, and if that's unreconcilable? Like, right, I've hired firms where I don't think they did a good job. What do you think the best course of actions are to try and get to a point where everyone is in the best place that they can be given those dynamics?
Then what we do is we sit down with them and have a conversation, one very direct and with candor, to say, okay, this is the choice that you're now making and that you're asking of us, which means if you want to keep the timeline and the budget the same, and you want this area to now go in a different direction, i.e., you've added complexity, we've changed course, so maybe there's some rework or whatever, you've got to give something up somewhere else, right? You can't have it all. And so those are the kinds of conversations that we want to have with our clients, right? Where we say, all right, this change, we'll deal with it, we'll take it on. You got to give something up somewhere else. Otherwise, budget, timeline has to change because you just have changed. We were driving to Nashville and now we're driving to Des Moines. It's different.
Yeah. So, this has been a really great conversation, and I think it in many ways, it's hardest to take the first steps in this for a lot of companies and owner operators. So if you were just to kind of give your advice on, how and why they should move forward, what would kind of your final words be?
Technology is the greatest force multiplier the world has ever seen. And at the macro level and at the micro level. And if you look at the stock market, if you look at GDP, if you look at venture capital is now off the sidelines because of AI. Venture capital got off the sidelines for mobile, it got off the sidelines for the internet, et cetera. So when you look at technology is the greatest economic power and driver that we've ever seen. It's not only true at the macro level, it's true at the organizational level. If you have plans of growth, scale, et cetera, the only lever that you're going to pull that is going to give you those kinds of things with a reasonable return on investment is technology. You're probably not going to hire people in a volume that's going to get you to the same place that the technology would. And I would argue that you're not going to get dollar for dollar the same return. So I would start to think about what is it, and you have to have a real conversation about, do we want to grow? Do we want to scale? Do we want to become a more efficient and a better operating company that provides more value to our customers? If you say yes to some combination of those things, technology is probably the only thing that ultimately is going to facilitate that in a reasonably cost-effective manner.
Yeah. What do they always say? The best time to plant a tree was 100 years ago. The second best time was yesterday,
Yeah, right.
Something like that.
Right.
Yeah. I'm sure ChatGPT could tell us.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah, and those choices are hard, especially if you've had a company that's been a good operating company for a number of years and hasn't necessarily been steeped in technology. It's also a decision that you can make to say, you know what, we're going to continue making our specialty fasteners, and we're going to continue to run the business the way we've run the business. And if that runs out in 20 years, we're going to live with it, right?
Yeah.
That's also a business decision that you can make. I would just say that people need to be consciously aware and not just unconsciously making the choice to be technology laggards. If they're consciously saying, you know what, we don't need to play in these new technologies because we're okay with where we might end up, they're making a consciously aware decision. But most companies aren't. They just sort of end up somewhere and then they say, oh, why do we still have customers emailing orders in?
Yeah.
Right. It's not because they consciously made those decisions. It's because maybe out of fear they didn't understand technology, and so then they out of that fear and lack of understanding, they never really acted on it, and maybe their business could be double or triple what it is if they had overcome that fear and lack of understanding.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, and we really appreciate you coming on today and kind of sharing your knowledge. I think this is the kind of thing where some well-placed advice can save a company trying to do this hundreds of thousands of dollars and a lot of time and headache.
Tom, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.